Hello, everyone, and welcome to the session today, where we're going to be looking at Africanizing research ethics. We all know how ethics are important and integral part of our studies. Before we can commence with collecting data, doing our experiments, we need to get research ethics. So I'm sure you've had conversations and talks either with your supervisor or attended workshops on research ethics, and I'm hoping this is going to be what you've already learned on research ethics, but also to just center the importance of rethinking also research ethics. I'm going to share my presentation. Okay. Okay, so as I've just indicated, what I'm going to be talking about tonight is the importance of really reflecting on research ethics, what they are, what they mean, but in particular, rethinking research ethics within an African context. What does it mean for us to do research within an African context? And for us to be able to answer this question, it's important to revisit history a little bit. We know that research is something that has always been there for a very long time in academia, but also in spaces like the medical field as well. So research ethics is actually very much has got a history that's intricately linked to the medical field. And so let's go back in history a little bit to think about how we ended up having formalized research ethics principles. Why was it necessary for institutions that conduct research to think seriously and actually formalize research ethics and develop research ethics principles? History would tell us that as part of colonization, there were a lot of experiments that were conducted. There were researchers who were interested in understanding various phenomena out there in the world, but also understanding people and disease and how we function as a people and trying to find cure for various illnesses, right? So it was centered very much in the medical field. Now, as part of the colonization agenda, many of the experiments were done on indigenous people's bodies, right? Because colonization deemed indigenous people's bodies as disposable, right? People who were not white were deemed as subhuman, they were deemed as less than human, and therefore it was considered okay to do experiments that were often very dangerous on people's bodies. So they were easily discarded. And the example here is the modern day gynecology field that we know, that we've come to know, that we've come to also understand and use the services of gynecologists. So James Marion Sims conducted experiments and he conducted surgical techniques of gynecology on Black women's bodies, right? To understand how the woman's reproductive system works and all things that are related to gynecology. But what James did was that no anesthesia was used. So women were just put on the table. Surgical procedures were done on them, experiments were done on them to try and understand, as I've said, how the body functions, except all of this was done when people were awake without any anesthesia. And the reason used was that, but they don't feel pain anyway. You know, the women don't feel pain anyway. So horrid things were done on human bodies in the name of research, in the name of experimenting. So many, many, many lives were lost as a result of this, right? So this is part of the history that led to us having ethics principles today. Another example also of the experiments, research experiments that were done were also during a time when Black men were suffering from syphilis. This was in the United States of America. Black men were suffering from syphilis, and the treatment was not given to them. Even though treatment was available, it was not given to them because the researchers were interested in looking at the progression of the disease. They were interested in looking at how long does it take one to get to the end, to get to a point where they die. And so people were denied treatment. People were given placebos, thinking that they're given medication to treat their syphilis while they were not. And this was inhumane, obviously, right? So this is another example, again, done on indigenous people's bodies, on Black people's bodies. Syphilis was on Black men's bodies, right? And then the last example that I want to give before I move on then is the one on stem cell. So today we do a lot of stem cell research. We do genome research. Here at UNISA, some of you might be aware that we have the genome research and projects that we do at the institution. And we actually lead a very huge project on genome research, which is wonderful in terms of assisting us to be able to get answers and solutions to the challenges and problems that we have. Research is important. Research on gynecology is important. Research on trying to understand various forms of diseases, including syphilis, is important. However, the procedure, the process that we follow when we do the research is very critical. How we do that research is very critical. So this goes for your own research as well as you go out into the communities. So stem cell research, again, how it progressed or it advanced was because of a woman, a Black woman called Henrietta Lacks. So who was Henrietta Lacks? Henrietta Lacks was an African-American woman who was ill and was in the hospital. She was suffering from cancer. And they found that when they were treating her and she passed on, they found that even outside her body, her cells continued to regenerate, right? So she had cells that were regenerative. So they continue to regenerate. So you'll see that she passed on in 1952. But even today, as we're talking in 2023, Henrietta Lacks' cells are still used to do stem cell research, to do genome research, which is fantastic. Except that her family was not consulted. Her family was not informed that parts of her were being used for research. So it was a discovery that the scientists were very excited about, except they did not acknowledge her. They did not acknowledge the breakthrough and that it was linked to this woman, and they did not also inform the family. Only after years, when it was found out that they're using Henrietta Lacks' cell, that proper acknowledgement had to be given. You'll see there on the slide, there's a statue in honor of Henrietta Lacks. This statue, I came across it when I visited another university in the United Kingdom. So it's standing there around the Faculty of Sciences at the university there, and it's one of the ways in which the university is acknowledging and paying homage to Henrietta Lacks. And they've written there that she is more than a cell. This was a human being who had a family, who had a history, who had aspirations, and that her cells are just being used for research without acknowledging her as a human being. Cells that are being used to save other lives is actually a history that we need to remember, that we must not forget, and we must keep acknowledging the contribution that she has made to the scientific community. So as we do research and we get our findings, it's very, very important that we acknowledge where the source of the information comes from, where the information that we're using comes from, so that as we publish, as we graduate, as we write our thesis or our masters, that we acknowledge properly those who contributed to the scientific and knowledge advancement that we have. And this is part of why Africanization is important. It's also part of why decolonization, which we will speak about next week, is also very important as well. It's about recognizing the history and recognizing why we are doing things the way that we are right now. So if we were to pause and think about why it's important for us to have research ethics, applications, and confirmation before we can even go into communities, is something that's very critical. But of course, the ways in which we apply our research ethics, the ways in which we go about with our research ethics principles also requires a rethinking, because we've been working from a universalist perspective, where there's this assumption that one size fits all. But we know and we understand that contexts are different and histories are different. And as a result, it's important for us to also think about how we think or how we apply research ethics within different contexts that we are based in. Okay. Again, research, when it was conducted in many of our communities within the colonized regions of the world, again, it was done and knowledge was taken from communities without acknowledgement, and assumptions and theories were developed as a result. Some of those theories were actually quite negative and dangerous to the colonized people, because it also contributed to some of the policies and the laws that were put in place as a result of what research says. So we need to be conscious, we need to be reflective, we need to understand the context that we're based in when we do research all the time. So as a result of this dark history of scientific experimentation and research, there was then a Helsinki, what then ended up being called a Helsinki Declaration. Because people were dying as part of these experiments, because people were treated as if they're not human, there was then a decision. So scientists came together, governments came together, and there was then a decision that it's important to rethink how we do research and how we do our experiments. And this is how the Helsinki Declaration then came about. Right? And you will note that most of the research, so from the syphilis experiment, from the gynecology experiment, from the stem cell experiment, all of them are within the health sector, right? Within the health space. So the Declaration of Helsinki, therefore, sets out principles. So the idea was to say we need to think about what it is that can be put in place to ensure that people are treated with dignity, to ensure that we've got principles that researchers, scientists have to abide by when they do experiments and when they conduct research, specifically research involving human subjects, right? And this can include identifiable human material, such as in the case of Henrietta legs, where the stem cells were used, right, or human data. So the Declaration of Helsinki is regarded as the most important document in the history of research ethics because it came at the backdrop of the kind of research that was done where many people would die in the name of conducting research. Relevant and appropriate research always aims to answer a new question, right? You want to quench your curiosity. You want to contribute to the body of knowledge, whether in the medical field or just in the scientific field generally, whether you are in the social or natural sciences. And therefore, there's a certain amount of risk for research participants when we conduct research. Who determines the risk? How is the risk looked at? This is what the research ethics are looking at when we say low risk, minimum risk, high risk, and how these are determined. So independent ethical review when we do research, therefore, is vital to ensure that participants are safe. And this is always at the center of the research. Our institutions would tell us that we need to make sure that the benefits, always try to ensure that benefits outweigh the risks when we conduct research, right? So in terms of the overall view around risk, around safety, research ethics protocols are very important. But it's always important how they came about. That is because of our actions as researchers, as scientists, that this was even necessary, that we have to have them in place, right? However, and this is what's going to be the bulk of the presentation today. However, when we think about research ethics principles, it's always very important to think, as I said, about context. And Trickett here argues that our research ethics protocols as they stand tend to be ahistorical. So often we don't engage and put enough effort to understanding the history of the context wherein we're doing the research. We don't understand the culture of the place wherein we're doing the research. And this has to be embedded so that we know and we understand what the implications of our research is and could be as we work in the lab or as we go out into the field. So history then becomes very important. Do you know the community that you're working with or on? Do you understand the history? Do you only just receive samples for you to do the research without really thoroughly engaging with how that sample was received, where it comes from, who it belongs to, and the implications of using those samples for the research that we're doing? Right? So this is very, very important. We have disciplines such as anthropology. Many of our disciplines, I must say, have got a dark history, but there are some that have got a history that still lingers even today in terms of how we think about our disciplines. So disciplines such as psychology, disciplines such as anthropology. Because of the ethnographic nature of anthropology, it meant very long-term and very close contact with communities and with human beings when anthropologists were conducting their research. Some of the anthropologists would do observations over months and months, and they would live in the communities that they're doing their research in for a very, very long time. Nowadays, I think because of the funding, because of the time, you go into the community a week, 2 weeks, a month or so, and then you come back and then you write, right? And there could be a lot of arguments around that in terms of the depth and the deep understanding of the work that we're doing. But they all again linked to, is it possible in terms of funding and time for one to go and spend 6 months or a year in a community to really get an in-depth understanding of a phenomena that they're interested in? So that's also again something to think about as we're doing research. So what's important when we're thinking about research ethics or research ethics principles in particular is that a context-sensitive approach is needed. An approach that recognizes that people, that communities, and even their geographical and social situatedness are diverse. That when you do research within a particular community, it cannot be just transplanted to another community and then same results assumed to be applicable, or because you're doing your research within an African context, that as you're doing it among the Amazulu people, that the same would apply among the Basotho people. And that is why it's important to think about history, to think about context, and also how people's cultures influence how they see the world. All of these things you need to understand as a researcher, as you go and conduct your research. Where are you going to be conducting your research? Are you going to be conducting it in Limpopo, if you're in South Africa, or in the Free State? And what are the implications of context in how you make meaning of it and understand the research that you're conducting, right? So these are very important things to think about. And that is why it's important, therefore, to understand that ethics principles require flexibility in how we do our research and have our research practices. However, as we know, our research ethics forms, our research ethics requirements are all the same, and you need to figure out how within the requirements in terms of research ethics you fit in the work that you're going to be doing to speak and engage around the community that you're going to be working on, or the kind of experiments that you're going to be doing in your research. So the same ethics form. So this idea that I'll speak about shortly of the one size fits all, then becomes manifest in how our research ethics principles are put in place, right? The kind of language that we use also in our research ethics requirements sometimes can be a bit violent, right? In how people are described, in how people are categorized, right? So when we decide that people are vulnerable, what determines their vulnerability? How do we decide that this group of people is vulnerable, right? Within the African context, when you go back in history and you look at the role of women in communities, in the family, in society more generally, many women held very high position, and they had high status in the community, and the role that they played was also very critical. Over time, again, with colonization, with the entrenchment of patriarchy, some of these things shifted as well, right? But it's important to understand this history before determining that you're going to be working with women, and women are a vulnerable population. Because as soon as you categorize a community of people as vulnerable, that also speaks to the bracket where they're going to fall in when you're talking about risks as well. And it also speaks to the methodology of the research that you're going to conduct, right? It also speaks to whether you can do focus groups or you have to do interviews, and what does that mean, and how does that speak to vulnerability and protecting your participants. So sometimes there are those limits in how we categorize and we label. And it can also have unintended consequences, the violence of languaging, right? That when you deem people as vulnerable, you are already putting them into a particular bracket of being as a people, right? Which then speaks to how you're going to treat them, right? So this idea of how often women are treated like children or are treated as children then becomes manifest as well in how we name within our research or our research ethics processes, right? And this speaks to this challenge of a one-size-fits-all, that we have the research ethics protocol, which have to be applicable to all of us, whether you are in law or political science or environmental science or engineering. So this one-size-fits-all idea then becomes a challenge. The assumption that morally correct behavior can be replicated from context to context. What it does is it treats all research contexts as clear-cut cases. And as I've just said, contexts differ. And because contexts differ, the approach and how people view the world would also differ depending on context. Because how they view the world is informed by their culture, is informed by their histories as well as a people. And therefore, doing research that assumes predictability, that you've done research in this particular area, and therefore you have the notion or idea of predictability in other spaces as well, might be problematic, right? So when doing community-based research, often there is that appreciation of the diversity of individuals, or at least there should be that appreciation of the diversity of individuals, the diversity of communities themselves, and how we define community as very broad, right? And also the diversity of the different settings that we function in. This is important within the research space, but it's also important in terms of how we think about knowledge, what knowledge is, and what knowledge matters or what knowledge counts. So this point of departure, understanding the importance of this diversity of spaces, places, and people, informs the alignment of our research practices with communities and how they construct their reality and how their value systems inform the ways in which they come into the world and the ways in which they view the world. So as you're working on your own research ethics application, or if you're already working on conducting your research, or you are about to go into the field to conduct your research, these are some of the things that you need to think about when you engage with people, right? Think about the context wherein you're going to be working with the various communities that you're going to engage with. Now, these researchers argue that some social science research methods that we use are exploratory in nature. So for those of you doing qualitative research, for example, and as a result, the most appropriate ethical codes, depending on the kind of research that you're doing and the methods that you are applying, the appropriate research ethics codes are usually espoused during the process of fieldwork. So what does that mean, and what are the implications of this when you apply for research ethics? We know that when you apply for research ethics, some of these things are required before you can go out, so that the risk can be measured and feedback given. However, it's also important to understand that because you're doing exploratory work, your research is exploratory in nature, some of the questions that you might end up asking would emanate from the context itself, from the community itself, right? So this is in relation to the fact that the interaction that unfolds as you go out into the field between yourself as a researcher and your participants may redirect and change the nature of the research and its potential harm. So you might go out saying minimum risk, but when you get into the field, it changes to higher risk or from low risk to medium risk or to high risk, depending on what it is that you're confronted with in the field, right? So these are some of the things that our research ethics principles also need to think about. But also, as you think about your research questions, that you need to also be flexible in understanding that the questions may change as you go into the field and engage with the people, that what you may envisage may shift as you go into the field, right? So that it's not cast in stone, and you need to be open to that. And this happens often when you're doing exploratory work or where you're doing research where there's human interaction and you engage with the people. And you might find that, oh, actually the question or questions that I'm asking are not the right questions in terms of how people view things or how they would like to engage with this issue that I'm bringing to them, right? To some extent, when you get your ethics clearance, it does indicate in the ethics clearance that should there be a shift in your research in terms of what was approved, it's important for you as a researcher to then come back and engage the ethics committee and give an update in terms of how things have shifted, right? So through engagement with your supervisor, it's important to keep that in mind as well, that what you started with might sometimes not necessarily be what you end with in terms of the questions that you were asking. And what are the implications of this? And how do you then reflect on this also in the research that you're doing? So you should not try and force fitting what was approved into the research that you're doing, even though when you go out in the field, you realize that there has to be a shift or a rethinking in terms of how you're going to approach the research that you're doing. Constant engagement with your supervisor, very, very critical. And if the community redirects you in a particular way, to also not be resistant on that, because at the end of the day, it's about what they would like to offer and to contribute to the knowledge production, but also how they understand and perceive phenomena that you might be interested in. Often when you go into the community, a lot of what you would have anticipated or thought you're going to do shifts. And what we sometimes come across is students trying to fit what they already have in front of them into what happens in the community. And that in itself also has levels of being unethical, because you're imposing on what people should say or the approach that they should take without opening up to what it is that people want to share or to give instead. So that is also very important. Okay. And when you look at the ethics principles, one of the things that is at the core of conducting research is informed consent. That you cannot conduct research when you have not received consent from those whom you want to do or conduct research on with alongside, right? And this again goes back to what we started with at the beginning, that people like Henrietta Lacks, the men who were in the syphilis experiment, and the women who were part of the gynecology experiments never consented to the experiments that were conducted on them. They never consented, were never given the option to say it's okay for research to be conducted on them, right? But also, as we think about how then the ethics principles came about, that there must be consent before you do the research, is something that also requires dialogue and deliberation. Because often when we go out to request consent, it's with an already completed framework or questionnaire or interview guideline that we then say, this is what I would like to do. Do you consent or not? So it's often not in dialogue because you've already received the permission from the university and you've already clearly indicated what it is that you want to do, right? However, when you're doing, which is what more and more of us are doing as part of engaged scholarship, as part of co-producing knowledge with communities and not assuming researchers as experts, it then centers the importance of the communities as integral parts of the research that we conduct. So community-oriented research, therefore, sees informed consent as written in dialogue. So through the engagement and the dialogue and conversation, that forms part of that permission agreement or permission document that you would have, that needs to happen in dialogue, right? And again, because of the structures of our universities, where we're talking about time constraints, where we're talking about what happens when you go into the community before you receive ethical clearance, it's things that, again, needs rethinking. That as a researcher, it's important for you to really reflect on how you want to approach your research and what would that mean in terms of applying for research ethics, right? So in much of the community work or community research, consent is written in dialogue. Consent comes as a result of the conversations that you would have had or that you would have with the community. And this is found, or it comes through the formal dialogues that we have, which all of you would have when you come with the informed consent form. So that would be the formal dialogue where you sit and speak about the research, but it's also important to have the informal dialogue, right? And understanding that sometimes consent goes beyond just the person that you are engaging with. It could involve their family as well. It could involve the leaders in their community as well. So understanding context and how decisions are made within that particular context, that this individualization or the individual perspective that we often come with when we do research, it actually assumes that in all communities, decisions are taken at individual level, right? And that is not necessarily the case. And this we need to think about when conducting research. We need to understand informed consent as the outcome of decisions expressed in a trusting relationship. So when we go into communities with people we do not know, people who do not know us, if you think about your selection criteria in your method section, do you know the people, or do you know the community and understand the community and have some background of the community? And therefore, informed consent often happens with people just taking your word as you come in. So trust then comes later when you engage with people in the research process, when you either ask them to then do the survey or you do the interviews, and then you build rapport, you build the trust in that process. But often it's not an outcome of an already trusting relationship, because you come in with a ready-made form that was not written in dialogue, and that then requires someone to read and then to immediately say whether they agree or not, right? And And we then need to understand, does signing a consent form already guarantee an ethical relationship in research? Or an ethical relationship is about the process and not only the content of the consent letter and you engaging with the participant, but understanding that trust is something that is built as you engage with the community. Earlier, I spoke about the importance of spending time within our community to build this trust so that an ethical relationship can then ensue as one does the research, right? But now, how we conduct research is usually very hurried. And that in itself begs of us to think about the ethical implications of the actual process of conducting research. Now, I would like to speak about one research design, which is participatory action research, which has started to become very popular when researchers, especially in the social sciences, conduct research. But participatory action is actually applicable in all the different fields, or can be applicable in all the different fields. So if, for example, you are doing research in environmental and agricultural sciences, how you work with communities in a particular area, working on a particular tree, or wanting to understand a particular geographic location and the water in that area, for example, how do you engage and work with the community? One of the things that we're centering now also is the importance of IKS, Indigenous Knowledge Systems. And that requires us to work alongside and to learn and understand Indigenous ways of understanding the world, Indigenous ways of healing, Indigenous ways of understanding the land, the environment. So even within agricultural spaces, what would that mean in how we conduct our research in a participatory manner when we engage with the communities, right? So participatory action research in particular does not fit neatly with the ethics principles that require anonymity, as the method itself is geared towards emancipation and empowerment of participants who are acknowledged as co-researchers and may thus want their real names to be published. One of the things, again, when we are centering research ethics and their research ethics principles, is confidentiality and anonymity. So again, the challenge of getting an already approved ethical clearance before engaging with the community is that it often assumes that people do not want their real names to be used. So we would say, I'll be using pseudonyms for the participants to protect their identity. So I will anonymize and just call them P1 and P2 and P3. However, there are some people who would like their names to be used. Again, the dialogue becomes important in determining whether a person wants to have their name used or not. In contexts such as those in Africa, names are critical and central to people's identities as well. So for some people, using a pseudonym is almost as if the story or the knowledge that they share is no longer theirs because their name is not attached to the story that they tell, right? So these are some of the things, again, as you think about the research that you're doing, to say you are just not going to mention and name all these things in your research ethics application, but you need to apply yourself and apply your mind and think about the community where you're going to be doing this research, and have that also informing how you then articulate your research ethics application as well. So if you're doing action research, if you're doing participatory action research, it also requires a lot of time in the community. It also involves community co-creating the knowledge with you. It also speaks to the kind of research questions that would be asked as well. So when you're really doing participatory action research, you will understand that with participatory action research, when we say community members are core researchers and not just participants, because it's about emancipation and people owning their stories, it's about empowerment of people, then it also speaks to the questions that are asked. You might be interested in question 1, 2, and 3, but the community might be interested in question 4, 5, and 6, or a different 1, 2, and 3. And that then has to be engaged, it has to be communicated, it has to be agreed upon between you as the researcher and the community as co-researchers as well. So it's very, very important to think about these things and their implications, therefore, when it comes to ethics clearance and ethics application. And for you at UNISA, I think you are at an advantageous position because as part of the university taking seriously the project of decolonization, but also Africanization, these are some of the things that are also informing the constant revising of our ethical clearance processes and also the rethinking of ethics principles and how we apply them. So that dialogue is ongoing within UNISA. So I encourage you also as you're doing your research to dig deeper and to really think seriously about what does ethics clearance mean in the research that you are doing, and what would be required and what could rethinking ethical clearance or ethical principles look like. And here I then draw from the African cosmology or African framework. And according to Onuoha, African ethical framework reflects the African worldviews. Remember, I spoke about context. I spoke about the history of the community, their worldviews. This has to be reflected in our ethical frameworks, how we do the research. And is the process that you are embarking on centering the values of humanity? So when you now think about your own research and the methodology that you're using in your research, can you say the values of Ubuntu, Botho, is central in the work that you're doing? So it's not just about knowledge production for the sake of it. It's not about just you gaining your qualification, but it's also about the betterment of the community that you're working with. How does us understanding that phenomena from that particular context going to assist us to reimagine and rethink that issue or phenomena better and in a way that can bring about change or rethinking, right? And are you centering the humanity of those that you are working with? But also understanding that from an African worldview, individualism is not centered, but rather collectivity is centered, right? People's relatedness is centered. And this has to speak to how we think about ethics principles, right? So the community is at the core, the community is at the center. How people understand the idea of moral values, the morality within that community. How is that understood? How is that defined? How does that look like within that community? And then, of course, just like the Helsinki Declaration and ethical principle, at the core, when we're talking about the values of humanity, at the core is also about respect for life. So when we do research, it has to be for the betterment and the advancement of humanity. But that should not be at the expense of respect for life, right? Many people's lives were lost because of science, because of experimenting, wanting to understand phenomena, and as a result, life was not respected. So within an African worldview, at the core of what we do, the human is at the center. And respecting life, not just human life, but for those who are working in the environmental sciences spaces, also the respect for life in terms of nature. So respect for life in terms of the animals that we coexist with, but also understanding the importance of solidarity and justice, that the work that we do has to center justice. There's research that would be conducted, and the results of it actually undermines a group of people, and it pathologizes people. And as a result, a group of people can end up not being respected as they should because of the kind of research that has been conducted, right? So it's really important for us to think seriously about the research that we do and its implications. There was a study that was done, some of you might be aware of it, it's a few years ago, and it was in the Western Cape in one of the universities. It was in the field of psychology. And the result of the study actually undermined a whole group of people within South Africa. It contributed towards the stigma or historical and persistent stigmatization of a group of people. And they published a paper that was deemed scientific in perpetuating, or a paper that perpetuated the stigma. So it's important for us to understand that we cannot just hide behind science and then treat people in an undignified manner, and treat people in a stigmatizing, pathologizing manner. That respect for people, for the human, is central when we engage in research. That is very, very important. And so, because I'm talking about the research ethics principles and the importance of rethinking how we approach our research ethics principles, because of our history, and the history here, I'm not just talking about the colonial history within an African context, but the colonial history among the various indigenous people of the world. I draw, therefore, from other indigenous communities in other parts of the world. And here, I would like to just share a philosophy from the Maori people, and these are indigenous people in New Zealand, Aotearoa. And this principle is called the Kaupapa principle, right? And it's the principle of collective philosophy. And as I've just said, now with the African framework, central to it is the acknowledgement and the importance of understanding how many African communities draw from the collectiveness of who we are as a people. And similar applies also to the Maori principle of collective philosophy, that how we understand the world, how we understand nature, how we understand engaging with each other has to be centered on our relatedness as human beings, but also our relatedness also to even inanimate objects as well, to nature as well. And this can then speak to how we frame our research. much of the research that we do, much of the knowledge production that we've had within our universities is very much centered on the Euro-Western ways of doing things, which has been for a long time assumed to be universal. And so it's very deliberate that I offer you examples today from other indigenous communities who have also been thinking about research ethics and how sometimes it's not useful, but actually violates some of the community principles and understanding of the world. So the Kaupapa philosophy refers to the collective vision. So it's not just about you as an individual within a community, but it's about your family, it's about your community. So the collective vision, aspirations, and purpose specifically of Maori communities. So when you do research within this particular community, among the Maori people of New Zealand, you would need to understand their frame of reference in how they view the world, which is what they call the Kaupapa philosophy. So, and what they argue, therefore, is that larger than the topic of the research alone, Kaupapa refers to the aspirations of the communities I've indicated. And so instead of fitting our research methods, right, into a Maori framework, so we take our research methods and say, okay, how do we then just transplant it to the framework of Maori? The Kaupapa Maori assumes the existence of their own framework as valid in and of itself, right? So we do not take the research ethics principles and say, how do we make the community fit into these principles? They argue that the validity of the Maori knowledge, the language, and the culture speaks to a number of questions when we do research, right? So we're talking about the indigenous knowledges, the knowledges that are embedded in the communities. We're talking about the indigenous languages, in our case, the African languages, and how our history also, our understanding of the world is also embedded in the language, and having to think seriously about what it is that we lose when we produce knowledge only in English, or when we go into communities and conduct our research in isiZulu, Siswati, and then come back to the university and translate that work into English. What are the implications of that? And what is the culture of the communities that we're doing our research in, and how does that culture informs people's understanding of various phenomena of the topic that you're bringing into the community? So the Kaupapa philosophy, therefore, asks us to ask these pertinent questions. And I would like you to also reflect on these questions in relation to your own research as well. What research do we want to carry out? So what is your research topic? What is your research interest? What is the research that you want to conduct, right? And important, who is that research for? So if you choose a community in the district of Ekurhuleni in South Africa, why have you chosen that particular district, right? When you conduct research there, who is that research for, right? What difference will that research make? So what contribution is this work intended to make? Who is going to carry out the research? Is it going to be you as the researcher? Are you going to involve community members as part of the research, as co-researchers, or only as people that you're going to be gaining this knowledge from, where you're going to just be asking them questions? And they ask that we really reflect on these questions and think about how these questions therefore speak to the Kaupapa philosophy in this case. How do we want the research to be done? So not just you as the researcher, but also the community. In what way would they like the research to be done? Is that a question that you've thought about? And how will we know that it is a worthwhile piece of research, right? In engagement, in dialogue, in conversation, in doing your literature review, in looking at why this is a gap, why this is important. So when you come with a research question to me as the supervisor, this is usually one of the questions that I would ask. Why is it important to do this research? Why is this research worthwhile, right? Why should we give time and effort and resources to this kind of research? And one of the things that we often don't give enough time to, who will own the research? So you go into the community, you collect the data, it comes back to the university. Many of the indigenous communities have really started questioning us as researchers around the ownership of the research, because we come back and the copyright is yours and the university, because you're doing the research in the name of the university. But how will the community access this research? In what ways can the community also use that research and its findings for their own betterment and advancement as well? And then, of course, who will benefit from this research? So this is one example in terms of how we can think about broadening research ethics, but also you can think about what could be useful and what you can draw from and what lessons you can learn from other indigenous communities and their ethics principles, right? So you should not only be bound to the Euro-Western way of conducting research or of thinking about research ethics application. And as I've indicated, within UNISA, there is more and more an openness in terms of how we translate and we think about research ethics principles. So if you were tomorrow to say, I'm going to be drawing from the Maori principle of collective philosophy in how I'm doing my work, because I'm working within this community where there is this collectiveness and the purpose and aspiration of the community intertwined and not just individualistic, but also the collective is central in terms of how people view the world. So the kaupapa philosophy might then be relevant. And then, of course, when we move to the other side, moving from Australia, other indigenous people, the Aboriginal people of Australia, the Torres Strait Islander people in that region, also have developed their own ethical conduct expectations in research. And this was because the many indigenous communities have realized that this Euro-Western way of approaching ethical principles has not been fully useful within diverse communities. And so the Aboriginal people, together with the Torres Islanders, developed guidelines and said, when we work with universities, when we work with academia, as a people understanding our own history and how we function as a community, we are going to develop guidelines for researchers and other stakeholders who are interested in doing research among and with our communities. And they came up with 6 core values, which are embedded in their own worldviews. And you'll note with some of these guidelines or frameworks, there are some core values that run across. Even with the Euro-Western framework, there are some that run across, right? But the argument is that the Euro-Western is insufficient as it stands. So in of itself is not all-encompassing and therefore cannot be fully applicable in all the contexts, right? So with the Aboriginal and Torres Islanders, they center spirituality, right? Again, very much similar to African ways of being, that human beings are spiritual beings, and their spirituality also informs how they engage with each other. So many of the rituals and ceremonies that are there within these communities are an integral part of how people make sense of the world. So they speak about the core values, spirit and integrity, and then cultural continuity, understanding how culture is not just fixed, but also how one generation moving to the next generation, culture and ways of being are passed on from one generation to another. So that continuity in terms of people's cultures is at the core of how people make meaning of the world, right? And then the importance of equity as well. There has to be equity in the processes that we follow when we conduct research. And then the last three you'll see, they will sound familiar to you: reciprocity, respect, and responsibility. Very much at the core, that as a researcher, you need to be responsible and have responsibility in terms of how you conduct the research. And then respect more broadly, you can say respect for people's context, for their humanity, respect for life. So respect is always at the core when it comes to doing research and doing research in an ethical manner. And there has to be reciprocity. In the Kaupapa philosophy, I spoke about who is going to benefit, right? Who owns the work. So there has to be a reciprocal engagement or reciprocal relationship between us as researchers and the communities that we're working with. And how does that show itself in the work that we're doing? How is it showing itself in your own research? And ethics are about respect. They're about caring for the next person. We do research because we perhaps are curious, but more than that, we're also interested in justice. We're interested in well-being of our world, well-being of people in the world. And so at the core of ethics is this idea or notion of care, right? So the idea of care is often devalued and not centered due to, again, the dominance of this universalist conception of ethics, where we assume that one shoe fits all, which, and this attempts to construct a totality of rules. So we function from this ethics Bible, if you will, where we're told it's about benevolence, confidentiality, anonymity, respect, all of these. So there is this totality of rules and norms and principles which are to be equally applicable to everyone. And for the longest time, this is how we've applied the ethics principles. And we've done this based on the history that we have when it comes to scientific research. It was out of fear, but it was also out of making sure that there isn't risks, but that people are also not sued, right? That these are the international standards when it comes to ethics. But the question is, whose standards? International as determined by whom? And as you've seen now with the Kaupapa principle, with the Torres Island and Aboriginal peoples framework as well, that actually the international standards require a rethinking. So you as students doing your honors, doing your master's, doing your PhD, these are critical questions that you need to ask. So as much as you are critically analyzing literature and thinking deeply about the theoretical framework or conceptual framework that you use in your research, it's also equally important to critically think about the ethics processes and principles that you want to apply in your own research as well, right? It's very important. And ethics of care focuses on fulfilling the needs of others and to maintaining harmonious relations. I won't repeat myself. I'm sure you can see how this relates to what I've just shared from the other indigenous peoples' frame of looking at ethics, right? And by doing so, then you are centering the ethics of care in how we engage with our communities. Ethics are not just about, or should not just be about, ticking boxes, but it's about by saying to yourself, by being an ethical researcher, it's about me showing care and treating people with dignity and respect. And doing that means creating a trusting relationships and maintaining harmonious relations. It means actually going back to the community after you're done with your research to actually share your research results. Many of us, when we're done, we often promise the communities that when the work is done, it's going to be published, going to be at the university, and I'll come and share the results with you and the kinds of outcomes and way forward as a result of this research. I can tell you now, the majority of you as emerging researchers, as scholars, as master's, honors, doctoral students do not go back to the communities. And that goes against the ethics of care. So I'm therefore saying, let's respect our communities enough that when they take their time and make the effort to be generous enough to share their experiences with us, that we also care enough to go back to the communities to share the outcomes of our research. And I'm going to just spend the last few minutes of the presentation focusing specifically on African-centered ethics. So with the African-centered ethics, what we're calling for is situated ethics. Again, contextualized or contextual ethics that considers the relevance and application of ethical principles and guidelines. That does not assume a universal perspective for the different studies that we conduct, in the different contexts that we're conducting these studies in. And that takes into account the realities of complex individual, institutional, and national imbalances in power and resources. Within Africa, we know and we understand the systemic challenges. We understand the complicated history that we come from. Within South Africa in particular, we understand how apartheid shaped who we are as a people. And today also how we still engage with each other and the institutions that we are part of. That the persisting imbalances in power and allocation of resources also contribute the kinds of experiences that people have in our communities. So this encompassing historical approach to understanding ethics is very, very important. So what could African-centered ethics also look like? What usually happens when we apply for ethical ethical clearance? What the San people have done, I'm sorry, I'm looking for the right slide. What the San people have done, so the San people are a group of people here within the African context. They're found here in South Africa. They are found in Botswana, I think also in Namibia as well. So the San people are one of the communities that we can say have been overly researched, right? They're one of the indigenous peoples here in these regions that researchers have spent a lot of time engaging with them. And so after realizing that researchers keep coming in, they keep coming in, they keep taking and they keep taking, but there isn't really something that's given back. There isn't an advancement. There isn't somewhat of respect to the San culture and its history. The San people came together, and what they then did is that the leaders, the traditional leaders or the tribal council decided that when researchers come, they need to get permission from the council, but there has to be a rethinking in terms of the kinds of research approaches that they use. So when research proposals find their way to the council, who are responsible for granting permission, because when you go into many of our communities, you do not just go directly and start speaking to people in the communities. You have to get permission. And this is what we call in the institutions of higher learning, and I use this grudgingly, the gatekeepers, right? You need to engage with the gatekeepers to be able to be granted permission to enter the community. And this is where the community council then also comes in, right? So what they have then argued is that often, and you remember at the beginning when I was talking about the permission letter and the informed consent letter, that we come with these documents in the community and we read it out, or we give to people to read and say, okay, do you agree that we can conduct research here? And even though it says we need to use language that is at 8th grade level, that also assumes a lot in terms of where community members are. And so what the council then argues is that the academic language makes the proposals that we bring inaccessible. And so they argue that researchers who hope for a successful outcome when they come into the communities need to be aware that the language that we use often is not accessible. And so we need to amend our proposals accordingly. And this is not something that we would be aware of or think about if we do not engage with the communities. So when we work on our research proposals, or when we develop our research ethics principles and guidelines, oftentimes we do not do this with community members. Develop these research ethics principles with community members so that they can be able to guide us, because they are the ones where these principles are going to be applied, so that they can be able to guide us. So the San people then decided that what you come with as researchers is actually not that useful for us, because it's not at the level but also of where we are as a people, but it also makes a lot of assumptions without even understanding our culture and our history. And as a result, there has to be a rethinking in terms of how you conduct research, specifically within the San community. They also then argue that translation of interviewees' input is also of concern. So the council sat down with academics, and you'll see here just the importance of this engagement with the communities, because we can learn so much. So what the council then said is that the translation of people in the community who would have taken part in the research is also of concern, because a lot can be lost in translation. I said earlier, when we go into communities, we interview and we engage in the local languages, and then we come back and we translate. And how many times after the translation do we go back to the community and say, is this a true translation of what you've said? But also understanding that sometimes we cannot even go back and say, is this a true reflection of what you said? Because when it's been translated, then it moves it away from what the communities can understand as well. Okay, so now the question is, who are we doing this research for? These are pertinent questions for you to think about as researchers and to contemplate on. So what the council then suggested was that researchers should find a suitable local partner. So we should not use our translators in the universities, people who've done translations and can translate, because they translate, again, using a Euro-Western perspective when we think about the rules of translation. So what they encouraged was that we need to work with local partners in the community who not only understand English and the local language, but who also understand the nuances in the local languages that are being used, so that they can assist even with the translations in a way that does not lose meaning. When we do that, we get more insight into the work that we're doing. And of course, they indicated that when we use the local partners, it's their time, it's their expertise, there has to be a daily stipend. And so when we're thinking about people's time and the stipend that is needed and what does it mean to move into communities, it then requires us to rethink our funding requirements or proposals. Often it is frowned upon when you as a researcher go in a community and you say you're going to give people money for their time, because as part of, again, the ethics codes, it's assumed that when you do that, then you might be persuading people, and when you give people some stipend or money, they can tell you whatever you want because you're paying them. And the argument, therefore, that's being made is that it's important for us to respect community members, right? And respect the time that people give us, but also respect the processes within various communities. And so we have things like what is called pula mulomo, right? It's called in the Nguni languages imvula mlomo. And in Nigeria, there is something called breaking the kola nut, right? So what are these? These are what can one call them? It's an acknowledgement and a form of respect and a way of entering the community as a way to acknowledge them, to respect them, to say we see you, and we acknowledge your resources, your knowledge, and the time that you're giving us. And that's what the Pula Mulomo is about, that you have all this knowledge. You are in a position to assist me, and therefore I offer this token as a way to establish this relationship between us, right? And UNISA has now officially included Pula Mulomo as part of our research ethics principles. So it's something that you can also maybe have a conversation with your supervisor about, to check whether they are aware of this, but to also maybe just get more information on that. But it is now there at UNISA. When you are a researcher, as when we do research, but also you as students, the Imvula Mlomo is now an integral part of what's accepted when you go into communities, right? And it also then means when we're writing funding proposals, these are some of the things that we can also include and also explain that from an African-centered framework or African ethics, these are some of the things that we need to center that are instrumental when we're working within African communities, and also as a form of respecting African traditions as well. So what the San Code, so as a result of all of this, the San people then developed what they call the San Code. The code requires that researchers agree, just like with the Kaupapa philosophy, just like with the Aboriginal and Torres Islander framework, the San Code also comes with a set of pillars. So they saying that when you conduct research among the San people, these are the underlying pillars that form part of the value system of the San people that has to be embedded in how you conduct research with us in our community. The principle of justice and fairness. Care has to be at the center of how you do the work, and also about process. That idea of continuity, it's about process and not just coming in and out. The content only does not matter, but the content together with the process also counts. And the importance of honesty, and again, respect. So you'll see respect is really a thread across. And then they give an example that, for example, within the San people, how you work with young people and old people, and how age matters and wisdom. So how people understand the world also contributes to how people engage with each other in the world. So as researchers, these are some of the things that we would need to understand as well. And I love this example that they give. Among the San people, both young and old would walk far distances in search of watering holes. And so when the old or the elderly could no longer walk, they would announce that they would sit under a tree, wait, and welcome death. In the West, for example, the Euro-Western perspective, we are told to respect life. But how we respect life, or how we define what respecting life is, also differs, right? According to the people's worldview. According to the San people, we must respect the choice to die. That's also very important. But the Euro-Western medicalized system of understanding life would detect what respecting life should look like. And so the San people offer us a different way of understanding what respecting life looks like by offering this example. And so the final requirement from the San Code is that there is a requirement that researchers, so you, in this case, doing your academic work, research, you need to report your findings to the council. And they argue that when you do that, that way you can have your PhD, your master's dissertation, your honors qualification, and they, as the community, can have the knowledge. So I cannot stress enough the importance of you going back to the community when you are done with your studies. Okay, so for the San people, they've even put it as a requirement in conducting research. So as one of the requirements in the San Code, that you have to come back when you've done your research, should not just say it. So overall, decolonizing and Africanizing ethics processes is very pertinent, because it's going to offer us a rethinking in how we conduct our research within the African context. So to decolonize and Africanize ethics is to acknowledge the multiplicity of understanding the world, to shift away from the universal notion of understanding the world, to see community members as knowing beings with lived realities that contribute to how they engage with each other and they engage with the environment. It is to have humility as a researcher to step back and not impose these Euro-Western ethical principles that may not be relevant or applicable to people, as we've just seen with the SEN code. Right? So these are very important things to think about as you're conducting your research. And then finally, we need to see our communities as collaborators and not just as spaces or people where we can just go and extract knowledge. We need to see our communities as collaborators and not as data waiting to be extracted. If we see and take seriously the notion of relationality, reciprocity, right, we will move a step closer to what we would call the true co-creation of knowledge. We would not just say it, but we would actually understand the importance of co-creation and what it means in the context of research ethics. So I'm going to stop here and let you reflect for a moment, but I'm also interested in some of the questions that you would have and reflections that you would have on the importance of Africanizing research ethics and what that could look like. The importance of learning from other indigenous communities and indigenous contexts. But also how you're thinking about this in the context of your own research as well. Okay, I see we already have a number of questions. That's wonderful. Okay, so does research on racial perceptions or perspectives on something require ethical clearance? Yes, it does require ethical clearance. Here, I'm not sure. Does research on racial perceptions or on racial perspectives, on something require ethical clearance? So the question that I would have for you is, these perceptions that you're interested in or perspectives that you're interested in, are you going to be interviewing people to get these perceptions? Or are you going to be giving out a questionnaire or a survey to get an understanding of the racial perspectives that people have? And if that's the case, then you do require ethical clearance, right? So in what context, how are you asking for these racial perceptions? Yes, you do require ethical clearance to do research like that. Okay. Issues of fraud, of corruption, of poverty are mainly racially linked or referred to as this government of yours. I'm of the view that they are context sensitive because of racial connotations in such statements. Do they require ethical clearance? Yes, they do require ethical clearance. So if you're interested in looking at the ways in which issues of fraud, corruption, and poverty are understood and made sense of, but also the argument that you're making is that they are racially linked, right? Because of how then people would speak about it. So how would you then approach your research? Would you go about and get people's perceptions of whether they see or understand the issues of corruption and fraud as being racially linked or linked to the government, or what is their understanding of the linkages between fraud and race, right? So how you then frame the question or do this research would also then determine the kind of ethical clearance that you would require. So, but based on what you've said here right now, yes, you do require ethical clearance. They are context sensitive because of racial connotations, definitely. I think in many contexts and parts of the world, there are issues around fraud and corruption, but how that manifests and how that gets to be understood is definitely very much context sensitive, because how they would then make meaning of why such corruption happens, why is there so much fraud, would be linked to that context history, but that context experience as well, and how that would then inform the ways in which people understand corruption and fraud. So I'm assuming that you are speaking specifically to the South African context, and how then utterances such as this government of yours, which is very much racially marked, again assumes a blank history. It assumes that there was no corruption before 1994. And I would imagine that in your work, you would revisit this history and you would engage with this history in terms of how post 1994, it's about this government of yours. Post 1994, this assumption that there was no corruption, but also how poverty is very systemic and created by the current and previous systems that actually relegated people to the margins and also disrupted people's development and progress by offering an education that led to people living in perpetual poverty. So all of these, and linking this to issues of race, to issues of colonialism, to issues of power, would be very important. So whether you do a systematic review, a historical analysis, where you don't have human subjects, that would also still require ethical clearance. So there is ethical exemption when you apply for ethical clearance. So if you're going to be doing just a systematic analysis, historical analysis, you still need to apply for ethical clearance. And then based on how you want to approach your research, then the committee can decide what kind of clearance you will get, whether it's going to be an exempted clearance or whether it's going to be a full-on ethical clearance. You indicated that you're interested in perspectives and perceptions. And I cannot imagine how you'll be able to get that if you don't have human participants, unless if you look at already published work that focused on perceptions and perspectives, and then analyzing that. But if you're interested in actually engaging in field work on this, yes, definitely you're going to require ethical clearance. Okay. One size fits all, very important concept contextually. People in KwaZulu-Natal might view corrupt government differently from people in Limpopo because of different perceptions of what this government has delivered for them. Absolutely. Absolutely. So when you then conduct your research in KwaZulu-Natal, you cannot therefore assume that what you find in KwaZulu-Natal would necessarily hold or be similar to what you will find in Limpopo. Absolutely. And the example that you give in terms of this government has built houses for us, it's done this for us, the roads are okay, whereas in a particular context, it's a different experience, there are potholes, and therefore this government is not okay, speaks to the importance of shifting away from the one size fits all. Thank you, Anonymous. I think that's an important contribution, but also applying how one size fits all can also be used to understand the ways in which we engage in different contexts. Okay, Waldo, can husband above 18 sign assent form if they married 15 to 17 year age girl? Does it have implication in ethics having participants who are married and who are between 15 to 17 years of age? Waldo, you ask a very pertinent question, because the question would be, does it follow, therefore, that because I'm 16 years old and I'm married, that automatically then gives me the status of adulthood, and it gives me the status of being able to sign things for myself because I'm married? Does marriage necessarily or automatically then lead to me being able to make these decisions? Very important question. I have not come across this, but it's very interesting. But if we look broadly in terms of the law and in terms of policies that are in place, if you are under 18, and this is putting marriage aside, if you are under 18, then you cannot consent, right? So that's what the law then says. Think about the research that we do in schools, research that we do with people who are under 18, where there is assent that is required. But in the case of conducting research, and as you correctly point out, we cannot go and ask for permission from the parents, because now the person is married and they have a spouse. So the spouse therefore has the right to be able to make decisions for the wife who is 15 years old. And then it goes back to the implications of what does it mean in terms of the policies and the laws that are in place vis-a-vis the cultural practices and laws that are in the community, whereby whether you are 35 years old or you're 15, when you get married, you move to a particular category and status in terms of your position within the community. So it might be possible that when you go into the community and this woman is 16 years old and she's married, that she has particular rights in terms of giving permission or giving consent to particular things and processes within the community, which might include saying yes or no to participate in research. Waldo, I do not have, you can see I'm very much interested in this because it is a reality. It is a reality. However, when it comes to our current or existing research ethics principles, I have not come across a provision for this. And therefore, I cannot say to you whether the husband can sign assent form in such a case. Please allow me, and my colleagues, Dineo, please remind me as well. Please allow me to follow up on this and check with our research ethics and research integrity office, and find out on this. I hope you'll be in the next session that we're going to have next week. I will provide the answer then, but otherwise, the answer will then be published on the other platform where communication is usually done from our office, the CGS, and you. So thank you very much, though, for that question. Very interesting. Can the kaupapa principle be applicable in South Africa with all the cultural and ethical differences, assuming that not all Black people are previously disadvantaged individuals? Okay, so I think two parts to your question. First of all, the Euro-Western ethical principles that we're using is also something that is borrowed, is also something that was developed not in South Africa. It's something that came as a result of the Helsinki Declaration. And then these ethical codes were developed and transported to all the different parts of the world. And then obviously over time, there has come this understanding that these ethics principles are actually insufficient in assisting us to work with our various communities. So can the Kaupapa principles be used? Yes, the Kaupapa principle can be applicable. I think as you're writing and you're engaging with your ethics section or aspect, you can indicate that as part of how you are approaching your ethical section or ethical approach to the research that you're doing, you're also going to be drawing from the Kaupapa principle, which says 1, 2, and 3. And from these principles in particular, maybe you draw from 1 or 2 of the principles and say, I'm going to be drawing from the idea of reciprocity, because in the community that I'm working with, reciprocity is very important. But you cannot perhaps maybe have that as part of the principles that you're drawing from, because the current ethics principles or guidelines that we have does not cater for or include reciprocity as an example. And so you can say, I'm going to be using the Kaupapa principle of reciprocity. I'm going to be using the Aboriginal Torres Islander framework of spirituality, right? Because at the core of the work that I'm doing, I'm centering the importance of spirituality in the community that I'm working with. Maybe you're interested in how the different churches also incorporate not just the idea of religiosity, but also center African spirituality in how they practice their religion. And then you say, as part of the ethical underpinning of this work, I am going to center or draw from Aboriginal notion of centering spirituality in how we understand ethics and how we understand the ethics of care. So again, depending on the focus of your research, and this is where the idea of the one size fits all becomes quite challenging, because we always just draw from that which already exists, and then we fit the work that we're doing in that which exists. And so the argument with centering indigenous or acknowledging multiple ways of understanding research ethics and principles allows for us to also draw from other contexts, to also draw from other indigenous communities that might have similar frameworks to what we have. Please note, I'm not saying the same framework. I'm saying similar because the way in which it would apply sometimes in a particular context would be different from how it would apply in our context. Again, because of the histories that we carry that informs how we engage with the world. You're saying that not all Black people are previously disadvantaged individuals. Maybe we should start by having a conversation, Anonymous, by what you mean by previously disadvantaged individuals. Because Black people were disadvantaged in many different ways in terms of their movements, right? The whole group of people, the whole nation of Black people was disadvantaged. Whether you had money or you didn't have money, there were restrictions in terms of where you can go. There were restrictions in terms of what you could get access to. There were restrictions in terms of who you could marry. There were restrictions in many different ways, right? So I think we need to rethink our understanding of disadvantaged, right? When we think about it within the colonial frame, when we think about it in the context of South Africa, within the apartheid frame, right? So if you were advantaged in terms of resources, in terms of money, that you had businesses and you were rich, you could not just wake up and go and say, I'm going to go and register at the University of Pretoria because I can afford it and because I want to study there. You could not. You could not, on the basis that you are a Black person. All right. So that then determined also where you could study and where you could not study. And that for me is another definition of how we can understand what being disadvantaged means. Okay, I think we should not limit it to resources. And hence I was saying I would be interested in hearing your understanding or your definition, what you mean here by saying previously disadvantaged people. Okay, and yes, I agree that when it comes to different cultures and how people apply those cultures and engage would be different again in different communities. Okay, so moving from one community to another, the example earlier about a 16-year-old child getting married and the implications of that and the ethical implications of that would also not follow or be the same if you were to move to maybe the First Nations people in the country called North America. Okay. All right. Fratel, what is the due date for the submission of the master's proposal? Danelle, Bronwyn, do you perhaps have the date handy for me? I'm not sure what the final date if has been given as. So if Danelle or Bronwyn cannot answer that for me right now, I'll find out for you, Fratel, and then we'll also share that as well. I don't have the exact date with me. Okay, Mpatwe, I've always struggled with the value relating to reciprocity, especially in South Africa. Okay. Zooming into spirituality, becoming a Sangoma is not the same in KwaZulu-Natal versus Free State, versus Limpopo, and versus Mpumalanga. How then does the university ensure that we do not produce ethically based research work? How does the university ensure that we do not produce, ethnically based research work? Appreciating that we are all South Africans, but we are not ethnically the same. Okay. Anonymous, my question to you would be, why should the university ensure that we do not produce ethnically based research work? And what do you mean by ethnically based research? Remember, we spoke about context-based, right? We spoke about understanding the diversity of communities, the diversity of cultural practices, the diversity of people's histories as well. The reason why, and maybe the problem is because we're calling everyone Sangoma, and maybe that's the challenge. And maybe, I know you might just be using it because it's a common phrase that is used that many of us can then be familiar with. The context, so in the Free State, where such a person would be called Ngad, right? In the Euro-Western, we will say Ngakayasis or traditional healer to again distinguish what healers we're talking about or doctors we're talking about, traditional doctor, traditional healer. But the Euro-Western doctor is not called a Western doctor or Euro-Western doctor or anything of the sort. They're just called doctor, right? But there's always this prefix, so to speak, in how we then engage with how we define and use language, which has got significant meaning in the ways in which we frame our knowledges and understanding. And again, it could be the issue of getting lost in translation, saying, how do you then define a sangoma in English, right? And very problematic naming has been used. And again, as part of the reclaiming and the unlearning of some of these very colonial problematized ways of naming becomes important, but I digress. The university does not have to ensure ethnically based, right? So, because I would not want to call it ethnically based, I would like to call it contextual based research, right? That acknowledges the diversity, that acknowledges that a sangoma or becoming a sangoma or the processes of becoming a sangoma within the KwaZulu context would be different from the processes of becoming a ngaka in the Free State context, solely based on the histories, based on the cultures, based on the traditions, based on how all of those inform how people would understand the idea of healing, the idea of well-being, right? We speak about this collective way of understanding, but the manifestation of this would be different based on the different cultural practices that people would have, right? We have different rituals and different rites and different ceremonies. You think about our initiation rites, our rites of passage. All of these are meant to serve a particular cause in the process of becoming in our communities, in our cultures. But this process of becoming, this idea of personhood, manifests differently among the Shanti people, maybe, among the Yoruba people, among the Zulu people, right? And all of these are within the framework of the African-centered framework. Understanding that multiplicity and context-based understanding. So this is why when you do the research, it's important for you to foreground this, to say you are doing this work in Limpopo, among the Vavenda people whose history is 1, 2, and 3, whose culture and understanding of healing, of becoming a healer, involves 1, 2, and 3, right? And as the university, we would understand that this is not an ethnically based and the form of research that undermines other ways of being, but it's to assist us to understand the processes of becoming a healer within a particular context. So at the core of it, it's about healing. It's about well-being. How a Euro-Western doctor gets to that level, how a psychologist gets to that level, how ngaka ya setso or a sangoma gets to that level is the process that we would want to understand and engage with. And that understanding also offers the opportunity to look for ways in which we can work together even, right? It's an ongoing conversation around how our sangomas, our dingaka tsa rona, can work together with the mainstream doctors. But often the challenge is that the Euro-Western way tends to consume and swallow. So the sangomas would need to fit into a system that did not have them in mind and have to now reconfigure themselves to be able to function within even ethical principles that may not be aligned to how they do the work. Okay. The African-centered ethics concept is a brilliant idea, but my issue lies in the inadequacy of scholar articles in finance and accounting that are African-centered, and we're mostly forced to run our research in a Eurocentric perception narrative. I agree with you. I agree with you, and it's work in progress. I think the whole project of Africanization seeks to speak to this, and there's more and more work that is responding to the challenge that you're raising. And I agree with you that even us as scholars, as researchers, as supervisors, tend to want to stick to what we're comfortable in. And we then rely on that which we were trained in, and then we tend to impose that on you as our students. So it's going to require a lot of unlearning and relearning, not only from your side as students, but also from our side as scholars, as researchers. And the more we're doing the research, you doing the research right now, going to contribute to the body of knowledge and scholar articles that can be available. And I would encourage you to even look into some of the workshops or summer schools that focus on decolonization, and look at some of the scholars that are doing the work on African-centered ways of doing, but also in particular African-centered ethics. I know there's work in environmental sciences, there's work in mathematics, and I'm sure there's someone doing work in finance as well. So that's also just something to think about. But I absolutely agree with you. The inadequacy is there, and that's why we need all of you to be doing the work. I'm going to request just for 5 more minutes to try and see if I can attend to a few of the questions, and the ones that I cannot attend to, I would like to invite you, please. The next session that we're going to have on decolonization is very much linked to what we've been talking about today. So some of the questions will then be answered as part of the introduction to that session next week. Okay. The language issue is extremely critical in addressing future research. We refer to integrated reporting and auditors' reports in our research work, but ugogo, umalume, who is part of my sample, somewhere in KwaZulu, might not understand financial instruments or notes to the financial statement, and it's harder to translate accounting without losing context. Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's why these conversations are important. And that's why these kinds of framing and questioning is very important, because it's going to push us to say, how do we do our research differently? How do we report the work that we're doing in a way that is beneficial to the communities, right? So the auditor's report has meaning and it's got implications for ogogo, omalume, right? But the grandmother, the uncle, may not necessarily understand, as you say. However, they are going to be directly affected and impacted by these reports and what they say and what they suggest for the future. And so it's therefore critical for us as researchers to then say, how can we do our research in a way that centers the importance of having our work being translatable? And here we're talking about translating not in the literal sense of from one language to another, but translating the work in a way that speaks to where people are and their understanding of issues of finance as well, right? And doing this, as you say, without losing context. It is work in progress, but I think it starts with us asking such questions and confronting ourselves and questioning where we are right now. Because by doing so, we will then move towards finding ways to address these pertinent issues that we are asking right now and confronting ourselves on. Okay. All right. I think I will stop here. Quick one from Gloria. Is this Pula Mulomo or Kolana token applicable if your research community is a company, for instance, power generation and distribution system? Yes, as I said, the community needs to be understood broadly. So when I'm saying community, I'm not just talking about a community somewhere in a rural area or a community in a township. It could be any kind of collective space, right? So if the company, this power generation company, is your research community, and you deem it important for you to offer such a token as a way to acknowledge and to appreciate the community and those who form part of that community, yes, by all means, it would be applicable. Because I think it's important for us to understand community more broadly. Okay. I think I'm going to stop here for tonight. Melanie and all the other colleagues, I will respond to your questions in the next lecture. I hope you will be able to attend that lecture. But I think what I will also do, just to try and be fair to everybody so that I don't hold you hostage and force you to attend, even though I would like you to attend, I will also just offer summaries of responses that I will share with my colleagues to also put on the platform for you to then see the responses to the questions that you have. Doing it at the next session also affords you the opportunity to have follow-up questions if you want, but to also see how they may be linked to some of the issues that we're going to be focusing on next week. Okay, so it's an encouragement from my side, but also, as I've said, I will not hold you hostage. I will respond to the questions that you've raised that I did not get the time to attend to tonight. And with that, I would like to thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your afternoon, the rest of your evening, and I look forward to seeing you again in the next session. Thank you very much and goodbye.